All right, let's wrap up a couple of things from today's outline. And really, I wanted to hit on a couple of things really from the chapter, starting with the Duke Lacrosse case. I mentioned to you in class today that in the Duke Lacrosse case, the kids were probably not innocent, certainly, but they weren't guilty of what they had been charged with. And indeed, when we discussed this, the district attorney was ultimately disbarred. He made up some charges in order to gain favor in a largely black area of Durham, North Carolina. He did win his election, but ultimately when the charges came about that he had lied about some evidence, he was disbarred. He is no longer district attorney, and he had to do some time on this. No questions about this. The Duke Lacrosse kids, the 3 kids that were actually charged in this matter, they were expelled from the school. They are in the process now of actually gaining some damages from Duke University, and certainly some apologies, I believe, have already been given. But the fact is that Duke Lacrosse, the Duke University, did not wait for the lacrosse team to be proven guilty, in fact, when they were innocent. The Duke University did, in fact, distance them, just like we had talked about in class, distance themselves from the situation. The coach, I don't really know what happened to the coach. He's not at Duke, and he's not headed back anytime soon. And then as far as the young lady, think about this. The young lady who was the exotic dancer, she did indeed dance. She did indeed get that scholarship that Jesse Jackson had led basically the charge for, and indeed she did lie. She is not subject to any criminal penalties, or at least she has not been. Frankly, the district attorney took the fall for this, but had she not lied in the beginning, fact is that there never would have been this scandal. Never would have been this form of scandal. The other day we had talked a little bit about the court packing plan. And when we were talking about the court packing plan, if you'll recall, I had mentioned to you that when FDR had first gotten into office, he had 4 conservative justices. He had 2 justices that were the swing justices. And then he also had 3 justices over here that were the liberals. When he first got into office, if you remember, the conservative justices and the swing justices joined together against the liberals, and FDR was getting all of his decisions struck down 6-3. I had mentioned to you regarding FDR's court packing plan, and I believe this was Communist Alex that had brought this up. The idea was that Roosevelt wanted to appoint 6 new justices for every justice that was on the court that basically was above 70 years old. So instead of actually losing 6-3, when you add these 6 justices to the liberal side, FDR was going to begin to win 9-6. Pretty straightforward. What we didn't talk about, it wasn't that the Congress struck it down, it wasn't that the court struck this down, but basically what it was there was an unbelievable amount of negative reception to this plan by the American people. This plan was basically known as the switch in time that saves 9, or FDR's court packing plan. And basically the switch that we're referring to is that these 2 swing justices switched. So instead of voting with the conservatives, they began to swing over and they began to vote with the liberals. So instead of losing 6-3, or indeed trying to win 9-6 by appointing some younger, new blood justices, Roosevelt began to win 5-4. It was the switch, if you will, in time that saved 9. Meaning, had those 2 swing justices not begun to vote liberal, then the court would not have remained at 9 members. They switched just in time. The court was a little bit embarrassed, quite frankly, after this whole circumstance with FDR and with the presidency with this switch in time thing. And it took them a little while to figure out exactly what they were going to do. But they came up with something that was known as Footnote 4. Footnote 4 is a very obscure passage, or footnote, quite frankly, in the Carolene Products case. Carolene Products, C-A-R-O-L-E-N-E, Products. Footnote 4 basically said this. The court said in this particular case that instead of focusing on the economic issues, the things that were dealing with FDR's first 100 days, where they struck down legislation after legislation to try and get the country out of the Great Depression, what they said in this is instead of focusing on the economic issues that just got us in trouble, instead of focusing on the economic issues that should be better handled by the elected branches of the government, we are now going to focus on civil rights and civil liberties. We're going to focus on things like speech and press and petition and assembly, and we could go on, unreasonable search and seizures, some of which we spoke about today. We are also going to deal with civil rights. Things like equal treatment before the law. We're going to fight racism. We're going to fight sexism. We're going to fight all of these other different inconsistencies, if you will, so that people aren't being treated equally before the law. The court basically said this, and when you think about it, in the aftermath of footnote 4, you started getting cases that dealt with the desegregation of schools. You started getting cases dealing, when you think about it, with women's rights. You started getting cases with other issues, maybe like gay rights, for instance, or even abortion. So when you put this into context, the court, the Congress and the legislature, because they're elected, and the president for that matter as well, because they're elected, they are not going to want to touch certain hot-button issues. The courts in the United States anyway, the Supreme Court in particular, because it's not elected, is freer to be able to handle those more controversial issues because they're insulated from popular opinion. Congress would never want to touch these. President would never want to touch these, but the court can, and indeed in footnote 4, I should say, the court absolutely did, and they've been very consistent about this for about 50, 60, 70 years now as time continues to pass. One last thing basically from the outline. Towards the end of the outline, we were talking about the United States and France, or we were getting ready to talk about the United States and France. When you look at the United States, we've got this passage that says that you are innocent until proven guilty. And a really good way to think about this is OJ. If you remember, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. And when you think back on that, the idea is, if you're innocent until proven guilty, the district attorney, the state, the government has got to demonstrate your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The state has got to demonstrate your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, when you look back on OJ, they were never able to establish his guilt. Maybe he was guilty of cutting off the head of his ex-wife and killing her lover. Maybe he wasn't. But the point is that in our system, he was never actually able to be proven guilty. When you go overseas, it's a little bit different. In Europe in particular, it's not innocent until proven guilty, but it's guilty until proven innocent. So the idea is that if you're charged, the presumption is that you're guilty. And when you go to court, it's going to be your job to demonstrate that you're not. It's going to be your job to demonstrate that you're innocent. In the United States, you can plead the Fifth. I plead the Fifth Amendment. I'm not going to self-incriminate myself. And indeed, you might not have to say anything at all in regards to your defense, because it's not your job to demonstrate your innocence. It's the state's job to demonstrate your guilt. Overseas, if you don't say a word and you're presumed guilty, that means that you're going to automatically become guilty. So the burden of proof here is on the government. The burden of proof in a lot of other places around the world is going to be on the individual that's charged or the accused. And that makes a big difference. Whereas they never were able to demonstrate that OJ killed his wife. Overseas, he would have had to have demonstrated that he didn't kill her. And in fact, when you think back on the OJ case, if they couldn't demonstrate his guilt, it's probably pretty likely that he couldn't have demonstrated his innocence, which means he would have been locked up again for allegedly cutting off the head of his wife and certainly killing her lover. One last thing regarding this. In the United States, we have an adversarial system. And I started this chapter by telling you that when you look back on it, the United States, we have an adversarial system. We're not trying to find the truth. We're not trying to provide justice, but we're trying to provide fairness. And basically the key players in courts in the United States are going to be the attorneys. They're going to battle back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And the sense is that if my attorney does his or her job and your attorney does his or her job, then indeed they are going to basically be picking at each other to make the case as fair as possible for their particular clients. And the more fair that it is for the particular clients, in theory, the more fair that it's going to be overall. And the more fair it is, the more likely you're going to get that truth and the justice that you want. Well, if you go overseas, particularly to a country like France, if you go there, what you're going to find is that it's not the attorneys that are the big players, but rather it's the judges. The judges are the ones that are going to handle the questioning. The judges are going to be the ones that are going to handle the indictments. The judges are going to be the ones that are going to be very, very activist. The attorneys almost have more of a judge-like role in the sense that they're a lot more passive overseas. It's the judge that basically orders the investigations, questions the witnesses, whereas it's going to be the attorneys that are going to be arguing about, well, is this the right way? Is this a problem with their case? These kinds of things. The judge is going to be the one that's really the big active player. So again, there's a difference really between the role of the judge more in our system in the United States as being more passive, more overseeing, whereas the judges in the French system really are more roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty, and the attorneys really switch off those roles as well. Here in the United States, the attorneys are roll up the sleeves and get their hands dirty, whereas over there, they're more passive within the system. One last article that I wanted to mention, or really two. One of them is going to be the disabled inmate article. And if you read the article, and I do have it posted, the disabled inmate article is basically talking about how there was a guy that was rendered in a wheelchair. A guy who was rendered to a wheelchair after, or as part of his conviction, he was put in a regular cell. Problem is that that particular regular cell was not big enough for him to be able to spin his wheelchair. And indeed, he would be looking at the same wall sometimes for 20, 23 consecutive hours because there was not room to be able to maneuver. The argument was, and he sued on this, and believe it or not, he sued under ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Basically, the suggestion was that if I've got to look at the same wall for 23 consecutive hours and I don't have room to be able to move or shift my chair, then indeed this is maybe a little bit of cruel and unusual punishment. It's at least not the same level of punishment that somebody who would not be in a wheelchair would be rendered to in jail. The guy sued. He wanted a bigger cell. This actually is very much like the Big Mike case that we talked about up in Canada, where Big Mike was hundreds of pounds overweight, and because they could not accommodate him with a cell, they simply let him out. Well, they didn't let him out here in the United States, they just built him a bigger cell, because under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you've got to provide accommodations. Some folks would say if you wanted accommodations, you should have never committed that crime in the first place. Inevitably, that comes up. But indeed, under ADA, you've got to provide reasonable accommodations, and if a cell is small enough for a person without a wheelchair, or I should say big enough for a person without a wheelchair, but small enough for a person with one, the state is going to be required. The state is going to be required to make an accommodation for that person, whether it be giving them a bigger cell, whether it be giving them a double cell, whether it be building a whole new prison, and of course you wonder why we've got budget issues. The last one is entitled A Deal Becomes a Bargain, or actually A Deal is Not a Bargain. And this was a North Carolina case from a couple of years ago. A few years ago in North Carolina, they were trying to elect a Speaker of the House. And when they were attempting to elect a Speaker of the House, it was unbelievably tight. They weren't sure exactly who was going to get it. They weren't sure how long it was going to take to get resolved. So one of the leading Democrats, a man named Black, actually offered a $50,000 bribe to a Republican legislator, Decker. Black and Decker. I know, right? Anyway, Black offered the $50,000. Decker accepted it. Black was the Democrat who was elected Speaker of the North Carolina House. Here's the problem. The investigation that they launched and basically Decker blowing the whistle led, if you would believe this, to both of them getting time. Here's the funny thing. The vast bulk of cases are heard in the state courts. And the vast bulk of those cases that are heard in state courts are plea bargained, meaning they never ever go to trial. The idea is that if I'm accused of a crime, I will plea bargain with the district attorney, meaning I will plead guilty to a lesser charge, and then as a result, they will give me lesser offense, lesser punishment, lesser jail time. And the benefit is that, of course, if I plead guilty to something lesser, this is going to give me a better settlement, if you will, or a better punishment in the end. For the district attorney, this is going to save them court time. This is going to save them court costs. This is going to save them having to go through the detail and the paperwork of every single case that goes before them, so both sides will get something out of this. Black, the Speaker of the North Carolina House, former Speaker of the North Carolina House, offered a plea bargain, and the district attorney accepted it. Here's the kicker. When you offer a plea bargain, there is no guarantee that it's got to be accepted. And as soon as Black went in there, having pled guilty to lesser offenses, the judge came back and said, oh no, I'm not going to accept this plea bargain. I am going to raise your penalties back up. And he did it as well for Decker. So the bottom line is, just because you offer a plea bargain is not a deal. A plea bargain basically says, you know, I'd like it to be this way because I know it can be worse. And oftentimes it will hold. But the judges can actually step in and they can override the agreement that you, the defendant, make with the said district attorney. In this particular case, they said because Black was somebody who was Speaker of the North Carolina House, maybe you might even argue the highest or the second highest person in North Carolina government, he offered or he represented a unique position with unique importance. And when he violated the trust that the people had put in him and violated the trust that had been put in North Carolina state government as a whole by offering somebody a $50,000 bribe, the judge basically said, you deserve not your plea bargain, you deserve additional punishment. I'm going to go ahead and get this posted. I've got all the articles posted right now. I will have the study terms posted before Friday is over. I wish y'all all the best of luck as you study.